Good morning. Jerry Aveta here today with my buddies Mike and Dave. We'd like to continue our discussion that we started a few days ago about the migration of faith into the political scene of today. And I just wanted to take a few seconds just to recap what I call the history or the sequencing of politics into faith in our lifetime, at least from our point of view. All of us are in the, I'm a little bit older than you guys, but we're in the generally same time frame. But I guess we agreed at our last session that we're in a different time, that things have changed, that we're into an area where people of faith are also into an identity based on politics. And there's little compromise once we get into that kind of scenario. And I love what Mike said last time, that in that process, we've elevated politics to a level of transcendence it doesn't deserve. I love that, Mike. And it basically means, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that we're getting to areas that politics does not have the capability to judge or to really discern effectively, that have theological context and experience. I guess that was your point, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Let me just take 1 minute to summarize. In my experience, from what I can tell, the first significant impact of faith into politics was that for the 1980 election, in which Jimmy Carter, evangelical, lost his reelection to Ronald Reagan. Now, I don't know where you guys were in 1980. I had my spiritual experience with God about 1982. So I didn't even know what an evangelical was, and I was even less interested in politics. So that kind of experience I didn't catch up to into the mid 80s or so. Dave, were you teaching in 1980?
Yeah, I was instructor, coach.
Okay. Because one of the big issues back then is that the reason the moral majority and Jerry Falwell did not endorse Jimmy Carter is because he was too soft and on issues. And one of the issues was defending prayer in school. I remember that was a big issue when it was finally passed. Of course, banning abortion and opposing gay rights were other key issues that Dr. Falwell thought that President Carter, as an evangelical, was too soft. But again, aligning with Ronald Reagan doesn't make much sense to me, and if that was the issue. But I guess at the time, I wasn't really sure what was the logic there. Since then, let's just fast forward. As recent as the Biden administration, I think the emphasis had migrated to, of course, gay rights, critical race theory. That I remember that was a big issue in Biden's administration and going into the election. I don't know if you all know much about that. I don't know a lot about it, but basically I think it has to do with the way history is recorded and its effects with racism and things like that. Of course, immigration was a big issue, and gay rights was also a big issue. But I think that the biggest thing that happened in those years was the overturning of Roe versus Wade. What we've seen since then is an acceleration of an effort to a universal ban to abortion. And I understand the theology, I understand the moral position that one may take, but I thought that was a bad move as a political decision because of the makeup of our country. But so the migration since that time has been the personal rights of transgender athletes, of course, the prosecution of illegal immigrants. It sort of escalated to that. With that as a context, I just wanted to introduce what I read about from Jonathan Rauch, I believe his name, senior fellow at Brookings Institute. He's a confirmed atheist, so in my mind, he's writing an objective opinion of what he's saying. And I sent you the quote. Let me just read it quickly. He said, instead of a theological affinity for Jesus Christ, millions of Americans are being drawn to the evangelical label because of its association with the GOP. Now, the data he's referring to is by Dr. Burge, and I have a couple of his books. He's a pastor in, I think it's an American Baptist church, and he's also an analyst of some sort. I love his writing and his analysis. But the data he's referring to, and these are the quotes from Dr. Burge, indicate that more and more Americans are conflating evangelicalism with republicanism and melding two forces to create a movement that is not entirely about politics or religion, but power. Now, Mike, you said that last time. You said the issue was power. And to tell you the truth, Dave, I don't know about you, in the churches I've attended recently, I have not heard any political discourse from the pulpit during the service at all. In fact, they steer totally away from it in my experience. So to hear you articulate that and then show us the information that you did, it was news to me how that has settled in to a certain segment of the evangelical community. And to me, it was enlightening because it makes sense now. It truly makes sense how I I couldn't get in my own mind, I couldn't reconcile how candidates who were totally contrary to, I believe, conduct of behavior, their attitude, their spirit, so to speak, how we could get behind a candidate like that. But it makes sense to me now. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. I wanted to read a little bit more from his book, but I wanted to get your thoughts on what I read so far today.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth that both Christians who call themselves evangelicals and Christians who would call themselves either liberals or progressives have attached themselves to partisan political agendas, believing that their their deep convictions are absolutely true and require the authority of the government to enforce them and implement them and realize them. Now, that to me betrays the deeper issue of a lack of trust. If I don't trust you to respond in good faith to what I do in good faith, then obviously the most efficient and expeditious option I have is to utilize power and make you do it. And if you don't, I can punish you. And that's what we have seen happening. I think, and then if you listen to the commentary, which is just overwhelming in our time, coming from both sides, this much of this is driven by a turn to power, but behind it is an incredible amount of fear, which is fed on a daily basis. Now, Christian people, I mean, our Lord says in the Gospel of John, "Fear not, I have overcome the world." And perfect love casts out all fear, right? And the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. But when we are guided by political commitments that trump our Christian and theological convictions, then this is the outcome that always has been inevitable, and history shows us this. This is where I'm disappointed in the Christians have allowed themselves on both sides. I mean, I'm a member of a mainline denomination that has not a large percentage, but a very small but incredibly vocal group of people who are anywhere from progressive to radically progressive. And at times they simply sound hysterical, and that they are so filled with fear that, the people on the right are coming to get them. And when we stand in that place and live out from that way of seeing the world, we're in trouble. And I think we're living in the midst of that right now.
Dave, what are your thoughts?
Put the original question back on the table. Mike got me thinking about a zillion other things.
The data indicates that more and more Americans are conflating evangelicalism with republicanism. In other words, what were two different entities are now being conflated into one and the same. That evangelicalism is being identified as being Republican, so to speak. The motivating factor of that merging is not faith, it's not politics, but power.
I think I see, I understand. I think whatever evangelicalism is, and that's another whole conversation in
Mhm,
itself,
mhm.
found a home in what now is the Republican Party. It may not have found a home in that Republican Party 30 years ago. It may, I don't know, but right now, and I'm not to get to, I think it's, yeah, answer is yes, it has. And there's reasons why it has found a home there. So I'll say, okay, that's in my mind, fact or reality. Part two is I think that's a broad brush to say that every evangelical person who would claim to be evangelical and the reason they found a home there was for power. I think that's a very broad brush. I think it may be. For many, for some, I think at that point, I think it gets really diversified and why I am finding a home here, comfortable here, taking a stand here, whatever there. So I'll just put that and stop there.
I think we both said some, not all. I would not want to say all. That would be terribly unfair and untrue. But there is an element. I don't know how many, I don't know what the percentage is. Berge is the kind of person who tells us those kinds of things from the research he does. But I think it's true. But I also think it's true on the other side as well. But Christians have found a home. And as Dave said, there are good reasons as well where they have felt welcomed, in that important convictions about the world and about human beings and how we function well as human beings, wisdom, have been in place in Western culture since ancient times. And what has contributed to that has been our classical knowledge and understanding that was taken in by Christianity and put in a place where it has much deeper roots in the work of God as the creator and the redeemer of all that is. Some Republicans, some expressions of the Republican Party recognize that significance. Now, those kinds of things can be taken to extremes, and which then sets off all kinds of conflict. Like here in Kentucky, a former Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court had the Ten Commandments inscribed on a monument and put in the center of the state capital of Kentucky. Well, Republicans, and this is a predominantly Republican state by far, would say, well, that's only right and good. The Ten Commandments, of course, historically look at the significance they have had for Jewish people, for Christian people. But others objected and said, well, you're imposing your religion on us, and you're using your authority as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to put this basically in our faces and tell us there's something wrong with us if we don't agree with you. And so it sparked all kinds of controversy, lawsuits, and things like that. And so this is where it's like everything else in history. It becomes very messy. And as Dave says, in the diverse ways in which people think this connection or this home with the Republicans should be lived out.
I mean, you're going to settle where you feel comfortable and where your values and what you believe is strongly is accepted, or at least it's not rejected. But after that, all doors are open. For example, and politically, you could take that and pander to that group, which has been done. And that's kind of like smart. It's really smart. And who wouldn't? They're being treated just as another. They could be. I'm not saying that's the intent. I can't judge intent, but the tendency would be there, and it's to happen. Well, now you kind of go after that group to bring more in, because more equals votes. And then the way that piece goes, I think that's where. I think that's a sidebar or a result of, but I don't think it distracts from the reality of why a Christian who believes that, is Judaic and has values that they feel God has ordained on us is going to feel comfortable in this spot. But after that, it's kind of like Mike said, it gets very messy, complex, and then people run with it for their own gain. Can, have, whatever. I think
That's an excellent point, Dave. And look at how politicians, like you said, play to that, which is what politicians do. You've got to get elected. And so then religion then ends up being a pawn and is used. And I think, Jerry, along with what we're trying to discuss here and try to be thoughtful about, we Europeans look at this and they get very confused. It's hard for them to understand, because they've been around a whole lot longer than we have. And this is often a kind of unique American thing, because we don't have long memories. Americans have very, very short memories. And if we were to actually take history seriously and not lift out of it those people and things that we want to essentially idolize and set up on a pedestal, turn into ideals, right, then that must be pursued and must be implemented. We recognize that, even in these moments of great glory in American history, it still was just as messy as it is now, and there's really no way around that. Now, what that does is